So, Ben Hodges, great to see you again. Over the years, we have seen each other a few times. I will ask you to introduce yourself.
Okay, Martin. Well, first, thank you for the privilege of being on your program. I am Ben Hodges, Lieutenant General, U.S. Army, retired. My last position in the Army was as Commanding General of the U.S. Army Europe down in Wiesbaden. I retired about 7 years ago, and I live now in Frankfurt, Germany.
So you've been very involved over the years, and this is how we got to know each other on discussing defense architectures and defense state of play across the board. And you were, because of your position in Europe, you were very involved and looking with great attention at Ukraine. But things have evolved or devolved, perhaps one should say, since 2022. And I was wondering if you can give me a general outlook of how you see sort of geopolitical, geostrategic defense, defense architecture standing at this point.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I want to be very clear that NATO is the most successful alliance in the history of the world. There's no disputing that. It's never been perfect. There's so many things that we've got to do better, but this is not something that we want to throw out and try to find another solution. It is the best. Now, the commitment of the United States to NATO, of course, has added some issues or concerns, I should say. Europeans, allies, and Canadians wondering whether or not the United States really is committed. So many times I hear people say, would the United States actually respond if a NATO country were attacked, for example? Is the U.S. leaving? Of course, people thought that even during the Obama administration, when President Obama talked about a pivot to the Pacific, immediately European allies thought, oh my God, the U.S. is leaving. So we can talk more about some of these challenges, but I just want to say that up front. NATO is a very good and effective alliance. It's being challenged. One of the Russian objectives has always been, since 1949 when NATO was created, was to drive a wedge between the United States and Europe. And Putin's strategic objective remains the dissolution or the degradation of NATO as an alliance. So all of the things he's doing now, the so-called gray zone operations, are intended to do just that, to undermine the relationships, to destabilize European countries, and to cause people to lose trust in each other. So that's what's under attack. And this is where I think the leaders of the United States, plus all the other allies, have to do a little bit of extra work to make sure that that doesn't happen. But I can't guarantee it won't. On the other hand, when I look at Russia, in addition to their objective of trying to drive a wedge between the U.S. and Europe, and to create disunity in the alliance, obviously they are going after Ukraine. There's been all sorts of different reasons given up by Putin of why he was doing this. None of them are legitimate. The only reason he's going after Ukraine is because he can't afford to have a prosperous, liberal, democratic Ukraine on his border. And so he seeks the destruction of Ukraine as a state, and even the idea of Ukraine as anything other than a vassal state. But he's failing after 11 years of war. And this thing started in 2014, that Russia had every advantage. And here we are now, and there's no way that Russia is going to win unless, of course, the West completely gives up on Ukraine.
One would imagine that for Putin, also for the Chinese, the Gaza slaughter has been a very, welcome distraction. I mean, it pushed a lot of public opinion sort of into that direction. People started to look at that. And for a while, it seems that Ukraine, sort of Taiwan and discussions about Southeast China Sea and so on, kind of fell off, not completely, but fell off the newsfeed.
Well, I would say that there was inconsistency during the last U.S. administration, the Biden administration. They never could even say they wanted Ukraine to win. It was the height of U.S. strategic thinking was helping Ukraine get to a better negotiating position, which I thought was a terrible mistake. They should have said, we want Ukraine to win because it's in our interest. This is not charity for Ukraine. So the Biden administration did not do that. And then, of course, the Trump administration had a completely doomed approach to this conflict. So I think people were just hoping it would go away. And you're right. The terrible attack of October 7th, 2 years ago today, distracted people away from these other things that were already going on. Hopefully, some progress has apparently been made towards a ceasefire and return of the hostages. I hope that continues to go forward. China, of course, given its geography, but also its strengths and weaknesses and its size, can afford to sort of watch and wait to see what happens. They benefit from cheap Russian oil and gas. Russia is clearly the junior partner or the little brother in this sort of relationship. They're not allies in the truest sense, I think. But China looks at the war as, okay, good. The war in Ukraine keeps the West occupied and exposes so many of our frailties, if you will. But I think China also is watching to see how committed the West is, especially the United States, to things like defending sovereignty. I think right now they see the U.S. and particularly the Trump administration as being pretty flexible on sovereignty. Well, that's bad news for Taiwan, the Philippines, and others that are in China's sort of area of interest.
What do you make of the Trump saber rattling towards the Caribbean, particularly all this talk about preparedness and of attacks on territorial ground of Venezuela and then blowing up boats in the middle of the Caribbean?
Yeah, I have a problem with the attacks on these drug boats. I mean, I have not heard or seen any legal justification for doing this, and the administration has refused to make the case because, at least so far, it appears that they don't feel obligated to have to make the case. I'm not against killing people who are invading the United States when there's a legal justification, but to just launch missiles at boats without having done all the other things. I mean, you could not do that in Afghanistan. If we thought we had an ISIS or Al Qaeda or some Taliban terrorists or whoever, you had to confirm who it was. And you also had to be sure that there was nobody else that was going to be hurt. And this is the law. And so I'm concerned with what seems to me illegal extrajudicial killing of these so-called narco terrorists. Now, these are not good people, if that's who it is, but the way this is being done. And I think that people that are in the chain of command that are involved in these decisions, they should be very careful, and they should make sure that what they're doing is legally doable, that these are lawful orders, because if they're not, at some point, the names of all the people involved in these strikes will become public, and the ICC could go after them, or countries like France and Spain could make decisions to charge them. And, these people, if they were convicted, would never be able to go abroad again. I mean, so this is not a video game, and I think we're in dangerous territory, I'd say.
Do you think that there is any merit or cause for concern in terms of a potential attack on Venezuela, on Venezuelan territory, and with the implications that would have probably for Panama, for Cuba, for the Caribbean, and obviously for Colombia, which has been, there has been quite a bit of antagonism between the White House and Petro over the last couple of days?
Well, the mistake the United States has made over and over and over and over the decades since World War II, in the last 80 years, is sending the military in to do things without clearly defining the end state. What is the strategic objective? We didn't do that in Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now I'm wondering, so what are we supposed to accomplish by attacking Venezuela, if that's what's going to happen? Now, I don't know that that's going to happen, but what is our strategy? What is the president trying to accomplish? Have we used all of our tools, economic tools, political tools, diplomacy? The president campaigned on no more forever wars. He was going to be the president to stop wars. And yet he is as quick to use the military as any of his predecessors. And so I think the Congress should, in normal times where Congress were acting in its independent role as a separate branch of government, would be having hearings about what's going on, what's the objective. And I don't see that right now. And of course, the government is shut down, but even before it shut down, you didn't get the feeling that the Republican-led Congress was executing real oversight over what the U.S. government is attempting to do in Central and South America. So the people should ask, what is the strategic objective? What do we want to accomplish? If this is just about our borders and stopping the flow of immigrants, I don't know how attacking a South American country, I mean, if anything, that will increase the number of people
coming into the U.S.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, much like different fronts, theaters of war have actually increased massively flows of immigration into Europe, right?
Yeah,
Syria.
This was Russia's what General Breedlove called the weaponization of refugees. When they supported the Assad regime, that put millions of refugees on the road heading into Turkey and then on into Europe, which of course was incredibly destabilizing. And then in Belarus, they invite tourists from the Middle East to come to Minsk and then push them towards the EU's borders in Poland and Lithuania. So that's what we're seeing with what they're doing in Ukraine. Millions of Ukrainian refugees trying to get into Europe. So weaponization of refugees is a real problem. And I think if the administration has not clearly identified the strategic end state and then mapped out a strategy to achieve that end state, we're going to end up with increased pressure from the South.
I want to ask you a bit about this narco-terrorism wolf, which is more or less looks like the crying of wolf. And there are striking similarities with the way that the Israelis deploy the term Hamas to essentially claim legitimacy for targets, which we know now are by a large proportion, or at least with a large number of civilians dead. I wanted to ask you a bit, what happens in the chain of command when it's very clear that there is no casus belli, that there is no legitimate claim being made, or that at least the usual channels have not been exhausted? I mean, is there a sense of discomfort? Is there a sense that, something is amiss here?
So I have heard from a couple of Israeli army veterans that there is discomfort, that they have to deal with it afterwards. Thinking back, there's a psychological impact to doing this. But they've also said you become inured to it. After the first few times you do certain things, you become inured to it. And I think this is where the government, the leadership of the prime minister there in Israel, has a responsibility to make it clear what's not acceptable. And I think we're going to be looking for a long time at how the Israeli Defense Force used force in Gaza. Even President Biden, you remember, shortly after the October 7th attack, he went to Israel and he talked to the prime minister. He said, don't make the mistake that we did after 9/11, being so emotional and anxious to get revenge, to destroy, that you act emotionally versus strategically. But yet, the mission from the prime minister was destroy Hamas. Okay, you can't destroy a movement unless you can destroy the reasons, the causes of that movement. And I think, even if we could confirm today that every single Hamas terrorist was killed, and by the way, I have felt no sympathy for people in Hamas, But if you could confirm today that every one of them had been killed, you still have 2 million innocent people living in the area. And, we always knew in the U.S. Army that if you go into an area, you immediately assume responsibility for the protection of all non-combatants. I mean, that's the Geneva Convention, which we helped create after World War II. So the Israeli Defense Force is responsible for the protection of all non-combatants. And it doesn't look like that's a high priority for them, at least in some cases.
Which really puts on the table a strategic question, right? I mean, if you cannot win the hearts and minds, as it was put in days of old, I'm old enough to remember people throwing the slogan around. One of the things that presumably we will see out of Gaza is actually a massive, increase of recruitment, because now there are generations of people that have been basically victimized by the Israeli machine. I mean, many of them might end up blaming Hamas for what's happening, but it's not. It would not look like Israel has made any friends in Gaza over the last 2 years.
I listened to a Palestinian spokesman or journal. What would I say? Activist speak at a conference just recently. A very impressive guy, and he was on stage with former Israeli Prime Minister Omer. And the two of them together did an excellent job of explaining what's at stake, what's wrong with the Israeli approach, what's wrong with the Palestinian approach, and what needs to be done. And I think most Palestinians are probably, while they absolutely resent how the Israeli Defense Force has gone about their mission, they also resent Hamas, and they recognize that Hamas used them. So there's probably going to be a mix of people that are easily recruitable. There's no doubt about that. But there are I would imagine the vast majority of Palestinians just want to have a life without gunfire and explosions, and where they can have a house and live and raise their kids, normal stuff. So I think what's at stake here in the negotiations to get to a ceasefire, which requires very active involvement of interlocutors like Qatar and Turkey and Egypt, to help get to a solution where you've got some sort of administration for Gaza that can be trusted, that will survive past sundown on the first day, but also where Israelis would be confident that young Palestinian children are not being trained and indoctrinated to destroy Israel. So this is going to be tough, but if they can get to a ceasefire and if you can get the hostages home, that would reduce the temperature a lot.
I guess one of my presumptions is that even if Hamas were to disappear, the question is, I guess it's something to which you pointed earlier on to, which is even if the group disappears, the dynamic for people not that would like to have a life with their children, but their children are no more, might not be so inclined to basically just forgive, shake hands and try to move on. I mean,
of course, yeah, it will be. This is not something that'll be sorted overnight, but and of course,
I'm not a big believer in transitional justice. So, I mean, I think that,
Israel, of course, has a very challenging domestic situation. I mean, the Netanyahu government is held together only because of a couple of their most extreme parties, right-wing parties, are part of it. And if they don't feel that the Israeli government is being tough enough or is giving way too much, then they get out of the government. And now you don't have a government anymore. So this is challenging in several ways.
How dangerous do you see this sort of almost a Lone Ranger approach, that actually that's probably the wrong metaphor, but sort of gung-ho approach that the Israelis have taken, shooting in every direction in the region, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, so far nothing in Jordan, but of course, I mean, Qatar with American bases, and I mean, really just a very, very strange moment. And in the last couple of weeks, I'll also talk about a potential attack on either Turkey or Turkish assets, perhaps in a potential line of contact in Syria.
Well, of course, Israel, like every other sovereign nation, has the right to defend itself. And we should not be naive about the neighborhood around Israel. The Hezbollah, what they have done over the many years, brutalizing, continuing to attack, cannot be trusted to live up to any agreement. So I think the way Israel has so severely mauled Hezbollah and what Israel did to Iran with U.S. help has helped reduce significantly that threat of Hezbollah, not only to Israel, but also to the people of Lebanon, so who are not huge fans of Hezbollah either. So that's, to me, that seems entirely legitimate. The Houthis, this is another problem that's got to be dealt with. They launch missiles into Israel. And so far, the U.S. and others have not been able to eliminate the Houthis as a persistent threat to not only Israel, but also to shipping in the Red Sea. Iran, I think, is, at least for now, seems less of a threat, although obviously they're continuing to work on having a nuclear weapon capability, and they are not without resources. The part of Israel's operations where I have the most difficulty is what we've been discussing, and that, of course, is operations in Gaza. Now, it does seem that President Trump has established a sort of power relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu that is different. I mean, I think.
Sorry, can I interrupt you briefly? I mean, you see Gaza as something that is more of a liability than the geostrategic positioning of Israel in relation, for instance, to Qatar or to Iran or to Turkey.
Well, first of all, I see them doing almost nothing against Turkey, and I think that what they're doing in Syria. I haven't followed that as closely, so I couldn't offer any meaningful comment there. But it's what they're doing in Gaza, which is what is causing the most international problems for them. I mean, that's why you've got European countries now recognizing Palestine, statehood, even though there is no government, not really, of the Palestinians yet. So this is in reaction, I think, to the excessive use of force and the Netanyahu government's approach to, eliminating Gaza as a separate entity, and his abandoning or his rejection of the idea of a two-state solution, which has been what everybody supported up until the last couple of years. So that's, to me, is the most dangerous part for Israel.
Do you think that there is, you began to talk about the relation between Trump and Netanyahu. Do you think that is something, we're seeing some movement, for instance, in the base of the Trump administration as to how Republicans, even MAGA Republicans, if they can be called Republicans, see Israel and see the relations with Israel. Do you think that this is actually having any sort of effect? This is probably a question more about American politics than anything else.
I think that President Trump has somehow established a relationship with Netanyahu where he has much more leverage, or is using his leverage much more than maybe previous American presidents have done, Republican or Democrat. Now, that's probably a reflection of, in some way, of the Trump administration's approach to Arab nations like Qatar, but also different kind of domestic dynamics in the U.S. I think no American president's going to ever turn their back on Israel. I think that's not going to happen. Nobody wants to do that. But I think that probably.
But the conversation around Qatar was very, very awkward. Netanyahu made to call the Emir of Qatar and sort of apologize, at least according to sources, and then
that tells you right there that I imagine he was probably told you need. That the president was not happy with that strike on Qatar, which ended up being a gamble that did not pay off. They didn't get who they thought they were going to get. And so I think the fact that Netanyahu had to apologize, that tells you that there's a different dynamic in play.
Do you, what are the things that keep you up at night, I suppose? What is what is what you see as the biggest threat right now in terms of stability?
Well, to be very honest, nothing keeps me up at night. I'm asleep usually before the room is even dark, so I don't have a problem sleeping. But when
Excellent.
I think about stability and security in our world, it's the lack of self-confidence in European countries. I mean, if you add together the populations, the industrial strength, the militaries, the technological advantages, just the wealth of all of the countries of the EU, plus Norway, plus UK, plus Canada, without the United States, it dwarfs Russia. I don't know why we're so intimidated by what Russia might do. Leaders spend more time worrying about what Russia might do instead of making Russia worry about what we might do. I mean, we should have the initiative of setting the conditions and making Russia live within their own borders. And instead, we are constantly whining about, oh, if we do this, Russia might escalate. And of course, the Russians exploit that. Now, that is my biggest concern, because that's tied to everything else. China is watching to see if we cannot get our act together to help Ukraine defeat Russia and make Russia live inside its own borders. We're not willing to use all of our economic tools, diplomatic tools, and we're not unified there, then I think the Chinese are not terribly impressed with anything that we say about Taiwan or the Philippines or respect for international law. Iran, of course, has no friends on the planet except for Russia. So if Russia were defeated, Iran would be totally isolated. So I think this, to me, is the key. If you're thinking strategically, linking together all these different threats, that helping Ukraine defeat Russia is, in the end of the day, is what will give us the best chance for stability and security in Europe. So what is most concerning to me is the inability or unwillingness to see it that way.
Do you see any change in that?
Well, for sure, most European countries, are being more open and recognizing that Russia is, in fact, the bad guy, the aggressor. I mean, you see that both in terms of increased aid to Ukraine and increased development of the Bundeswehr in Germany, for example. And just people willing to invest in defense, whereas even a couple of years ago, that was not necessarily a cool thing to do. So I can see changes, but we still don't have the sense of urgency. Hopefully we'll find that before it's too late.
Ben, thank you very much. It's been very nice to see you again.